Naomi Carter stepped into the courtroom, clad in a loose-fitting orange prison jumpsuit. She was only 14 years old, yet she had been wrongfully accused, facing a judicial system that was ready to convict without solid evidence. She had no renowned lawyer to defend her, no one on her side except her grandfather, Elijah Carter, a man of experience who had witnessed countless injustices in this society. The atmosphere in the courtroom was cold, not because of the air conditioning, but because of the silent judgment from those present. Hundreds of eyes were fixed on Naomi, filled with prejudice. To them, she wasn't a child, nor an innocent person waiting to be exonerated. They had already reached their own conclusion. Naomi was just another statistic in the juvenile crime records they had seen too many times. Before her stood Judge Douglas Whitmore, a man with decades of trial experience. To him, this was just another minor case, a simple trial he could wrap up quickly. Beside him was Prosecutor Gregory Reed, a man dressed in a neatly tailored suit. His gaze sharp and unwavering. He had built his career on swift convictions. And today, he believed nothing would be different. Naomi was just a child. She wouldn't be able to fight the system. Sitting next to Naomi was her court-appointed defense attorney, Thomas Blake. He had handled dozens of similar cases and had grown accustomed to their outcomes. The way he avoided Naomi's gaze, the absent-minded way he tapped his pen against his notes, it was clear that he had already resigned himself to her defeat. All rise. Court is now in session. The bailiff's voice rang out. Judge Whitmore scanned the courtroom before setting his eyes on Naomi. The indifference in his expression made it clear, he already thought he knew how this case would end. The State of Tennessee versus Naomi Carter. The defendant is charged with theft and property damage. The charges echoed through the silent courtroom, making the air feel even heavier. Gregory Reed stood up, straightened his suit, and approached the jury. His voice was calm yet firm. Ladies and gentlemen, this case is not complicated. The evidence is clear. On the night of the incident, the defendant was apprehended near the scene of the crime. Security cameras at Davidson & Co. Jewelry store captured footage of an individual whose physique and appearance match hers exactly. Furthermore, we have a witness who saw the defendant leaving the scene shortly after the robbery took place. He paused for a moment, allowing the jury to absorb the information before continuing. We can sympathize with her for being only 14 years old. But the law does not distinguish by age. If one is old enough to commit a crime, one is old enough to take responsibility. He turned to Naomi, as if to silently tell her that there was no escape. Yet, Naomi didn't react. She didn't lower her head, didn't look nervous. She simply listened, memorizing every word, every argument the prosecutor presented. But in her eyes, there was no fear, only a glimmer of something sharp. Calculating, Prosecutor Reed proceeded to show the surveillance footage. The black and white video displayed a girl in a dark hoodie entering the store. Due to the poor video quality, her face was indistinguishable, but her physique closely resembled Naomi's. The footage continued, showing the girl approaching a display case and reaching inside. Moments later, the alarm blared. She turned and fled from the frame. Reed paused the video and turned to the jury. Pointing at the screen, he declared, "This is the defendant." Moments before the robbery took place, the jury murmured among themselves. Some nodded, while others cast doubtful glances at Naomi. But Naomi remained unshaken. She stared intently at the screen, analyzing every frame. She was searching for something. Then, suddenly, she spoke. "I want to see the video again." Her request surprised everyone in the courtroom, even Judge Whitmore, who raised an eyebrow. "We've already seen it, Naomi. There's no need to review it again," Reed said, a hint of mockery in his voice. Naomi remained composed. "If this video is being used as evidence against me, I want to examine it closely." The judge gestured for the footage to be replayed. This time, Naomi observed more carefully. She scrutinized every detail, the way the girl moved, the reflection of light on the glass, every subtle motion. Then, she noticed something. The girl in the video was wearing a ring on her left index finger. Naomi calmly turned to the jury and spoke with unwavering confidence. I don't wear rings. I never have. The atmosphere in the courtroom shifted immediately. The jury members exchanged glances. Reed furrowed his brow. His confidence had just been shaken. But Naomi wasn't done. She continued analyzing the video, this time focusing on the girl's shoes. Please rewind and play it at half speed. Once again, all eyes were on the screen. And this time, they saw something they had previously overlooked. The girl's shoes were too big. Naomi turned to the prosecutor and asked, "If that's really me, why don't the shoes fit my feet?" This time, Reed couldn't respond immediately. He hadn't anticipated this. The room fell silent, and all that remained was Naomi's unwavering gaze. She was no longer a defendant awaiting judgment. She was a warrior turning the tide. The courtroom was filled with tension. Prosecutor Gregory Reed stood tall before the jury, his sharp gaze sweeping over each member, emphasizing that this case was crystal clear. He had surveillance footage, a witness statement, and a 14-year-old girl sitting in the defendant's chair, all of which convinced him that another easy victory was within reach. But Naomi Carter was no ordinary defendant. She sat still, her eyes fixed on the screen where the surveillance video had just played again. The girl in the footage wore a dark hoodie, sneaking into the jewelry store. The image was unclear, but the figure seemed to match Naomi's. Then, the moment the girl reached into the glass case, the alarm blared. She flinched and bolted from the scene. Gregory Reed turned back to the jury, his voice calm yet brimming with confidence. As you can see, the footage is undeniable. This is the defendant, at the scene of the crime, moments before the robbery occurred. And that's not all. We have a witness who saw her fleeing the scene after the alarm went off. The jury listened, some nodding in agreement. Meanwhile, Naomi remained silent, but a spark flickered in her eyes. When Reed called the witness to the stand, a middle-aged man with a nervous expression stepped forward. His name was Dennis Holloway, an employee at Davidson & Co. The bailiff handed him the oath statement, and he swallowed hard before glancing around the courtroom. Reed approached him, exuding a friendly demeanor. "Mr. Holloway, can you describe what you witnessed that night?" Dennis spoke hesitantly, his voice slightly shaky. "I was working late, getting ready to close up, when suddenly the alarm rang. When I turned around, I saw someone running out of the store." Reed nodded, signaling him to continue. "Did you recognize this person?" Dennis hesitated briefly, then said, "I believe it was this girl." He pointed at Naomi. Some jury members exchanged looks, seemingly convinced. The case was unfolding exactly as the prosecution had planned. But Naomi showed no fear. She waited, patient like a cat ready to pounce. And when Reed turned to face her, a triumphant smirk creeping onto his lips, Naomi spoke calmly, "Mr. Holloway, could you describe the person you saw in more detail?" Dennis looked taken aback. He hadn't expected the defendant to question him. He hesitated, then said, "I remember they were wearing a hoodie." Naomi nodded, her voice steady. "What color was the hoodie?" The courtroom fell silent. Dennis frowned, trying to recall, then muttered, "I think it was gray." The jury began murmuring. Naomi pointed at the screen, where the final frame of the video remained frozen. "But ladies and gentlemen, the girl in the footage is wearing a black hoodie." A hush fell over the room. Dennis Holloway realized his mistake, his face paling. Prosecutor Reed frowned, his expression turning colder. But Naomi wasn't done. She turned back to the screen, studying the blurry image of the girl in the video. Tilting her head, she analyzed it like a complex puzzle. Then, she spoke again, her voice unwavering. "Please replay the footage and zoom in on the suspect's left hand." The bailiff followed her request. As the image enlarged, the entire courtroom held its breath. On the suspect's left index finger was a ring. Naomi slowly placed her hands on the table, ensuring everyone could see them. Small hands, but most importantly, completely bare. She lifted her gaze to the jury, her voice firm yet composed. "I don't wear rings. I never have." The courtroom erupted in whispers. Jury members exchanged glances, some furrowing their brows. Reed maintained his calm exterior, but his grip on the table tightened. Naomi still wasn't finished. She turned back to the screen, this time focusing on the suspect's feet. Please rewind and slow it down by half speed. As the video played in slow motion, Naomi pointed at the screen. Look at the way she walks. Her shoes are too big, her steps seem heavy, unnatural. Now, compare it to the footage taken when I was arrested. You'll see that my gait is entirely different. And why is that? She looked up, her voice unwavering. Because that is not me. The jury was stunned into silence. For a moment, even Prosecutor Reed seemed uncertain. Naomi locked eyes with him, her stare piercing. You said this case wasn't complicated. But I ask you, with all these inconsistencies in the evidence, are you still certain that I am the culprit? For the first time in the entire trial, Gregory Reed had no immediate answer. And in that moment, the scales of justice began to tip in Naomi Carter's favor. The courtroom was silent. Naomi Carter's words echoed through the space, leaving an undeniable impact. The 14-year-old girl had not only dismantled Prosecutor Gregory Reed's assumptions but had also planted a question in the jury's minds that no one had considered before. What if Naomi was truly innocent? Reed, once composed and confident, now felt the pressure. He had never expected Naomi to fight back this fiercely. She wasn't just a teenager trying to defend herself. She understood the law and knew how to expose the cracks in the case, but Reed was no amateur prosecutor. He quickly regained his composure and launched his counterattack. Fascinating. His voice remained steady. Though his gaze had turned colder, he turned back to the jury, holding up a clear evidence bag. Miss Carter seems very skilled at pointing out minor inconsistencies. But don't be misled. The real issue remains. She was near the crime scene. And this? Reed lifted the bag higher, ensuring the jury could see what was inside. A silver ring sat quietly under the courtroom lights. This ring was found just outside the jewelry store, near the emergency exit where the suspect fled. And more importantly, it matches a ring belonging to the defendant. Whispers spread through the room. Some jury members leaned forward, scrutinizing the ring. Naomi stared at the small object that the prosecutor was using against her, but instead of fear, curiosity flickered in her eyes. You say it matches a ring I own? Her voice was even, unshaken. Reed smirked. Exactly. And if this ring is yours, then it's proof that you were at the crime scene. Naomi studied the ring for a long moment. She didn't recall ever owning such a piece of jewelry. But even if she had a similar ring, that didn't prove this one belonged to her. Then, suddenly, something clicked in her mind. She met Reed's gaze, her voice calm but firm. Did you check this ring for fingerprints? The courtroom froze. Reed blinked, hesitating for a split second, just long enough for Naomi to know she had struck a weak point in his argument. She continued, her tone unwavering. This ring was found outside the store. Correct. If it belonged to me, it should have my fingerprints on it. Or at the very least, my DNA. Do you have forensic reports proving that? Reed pressed his lips together but maintained his outward composure. Miss Carter, not all evidence requires fingerprints to be valid. Naomi gave a small, knowing smile. So you didn't check? Silence stretched through the room. The jury was no longer on the prosecution's side. Judge Whitmore frowned, then slowly turned to Reed. Prosecutor Reed, has this ring been tested for fingerprints or DNA? Reed swallowed hard. He knew he was trapped. Your Honor, no. It has not. A murmur swept through the courtroom. Some jury members shook their heads. Others exchanged skeptical glances. Naomi remained composed. She turned to the jury, her voice clear and steady. They want you to believe this ring is mine. But they didn't check for fingerprints. They didn't test for DNA. If I had worn it, my traces would be on it. Yet they chose not to verify that. She paused for a moment, then lowered her voice as if confiding in each person present. Why? Because they're afraid that if they check, the truth won't be in their favor. The atmosphere in the courtroom had completely shifted. Reed, once assured of his victory, was now struggling to maintain control. He knew the jury was beginning to doubt the case against Naomi. Judge Whitmore cleared his throat. signaling for order. After a moment, he turned back to the prosecutor. Mr. Reed, given the inconsistencies in the evidence, I want this ring to be sent for forensic analysis immediately. Reed stiffened. He was losing control of the case. Naomi sat up straight, her hands clasped together on the table. She didn't smile, didn't celebrate. She simply knew she had done the right thing. She had shown the jury what they needed to see, that the system didn't always seek justice. Sometimes it just sought someone to blame. The 14-year-old girl had forced the entire courtroom to reconsider the case through a different lens. And from that moment on, she was no longer just a defendant. She was a warrior. A girl who understood the truth and knew how to protect herself from an unjust conviction, and most importantly, she had turned an entire trial upside down. Naomi Carter, the 14-year-old who turned the entire trial upside down. The tension in the courtroom had never been higher. Prosecutor Gregory Reed, once unwavering in his confidence, was now beginning to feel the case slipping from his grasp. Naomi Carter, the 14-year-old girl he had assumed to be just another naive defendant, was slowly taking control of the narrative. The ring, his key piece of evidence, which he had believed would corner Naomi, was now the very thing weakening his case. The failure to test it for fingerprints or DNA was a critical mistake, and Naomi had wasted no time in exposing it, forcing the jury to ask themselves, if the evidence truly incriminated her, why hadn't they tested it? After a brief hesitation, Reed regained his composure. He could not allow Naomi to dictate the course of the trial. All right. His voice was calm, his gaze sweeping over the jury. Miss Carter seems very skilled at distraction. But don't let these minor details take your focus away from the undeniable truth. He turned back to the surveillance footage still displayed on the screen. Regardless of whether she wore a ring or not, regardless of whether we've conducted forensic tests yet or not, what cannot change is this: a person matching the defendant's appearance was caught on camera. And let's not forget, she was arrested near the scene. Reed took a step closer to the jury, his voice lowering as if to press his point home. We are dealing with a theft case. We don't need a confession. We don't need costly forensic tests to confirm what the evidence already makes clear. He paused, allowing his words to sink in. Some jury members nodded slightly, but Naomi remained unfazed. She had anticipated this move, and she was ready. Leaning forward, she placed both hands on the table, her voice steady yet resonating throughout the courtroom. I am not distracting anyone. I simply want us to see the whole truth. She turned to Judge Whitmore, her gaze sharp, almost like that of a seasoned lawyer. Your Honor, I have one question. According to the fundamental principles of law, who has the burden of proving my guilt? Judge Whitmore regarded Naomi for a moment before nodding. The prosecution. Naomi turned back to Reed, her tone unwavering. So, it is the prosecution's responsibility to provide conclusive evidence. Correct? That's correct, the judge affirmed. Naomi crossed her arms. Yet, the ring, the evidence they claim belongs to me, has not been tested for fingerprints or DNA. If Mr. Reed truly believes it's mine, why hasn't he tested it? If he is confident this video is enough, why does he need to introduce unverified evidence? The courtroom fell silent. Naomi continued, this time addressing the jury directly. They want you to believe I am guilty. But when I questioned their evidence, they had no answers. When I requested a DNA test, they avoided it. If you are here to seek the truth, you must ask yourselves, why? Jury members exchanged glances. Some looked uncertain. Others began nodding. Naomi could see the shift happening, but she wasn't done. She turned her attention to Dennis Holloway, the prosecution's only witness. Mr. Holloway, she said, her voice composed, I have a question for you. Dennis hesitated, glancing toward Reed as if looking for guidance. But Reed said nothing. Naomi locked eyes with him. Are you certain that the person you saw running out of the store was me? Dennis swallowed hard, his hands clenching together. The room held its breath, waiting for his answer. I'm not sure. His words landed like a bombshell. The entire courtroom shifted in an instant. Prosecutor Reed stiffened. The jury's confidence wavered. Naomi remained composed. But inside, she knew, this was the turning point. Lowering her voice, she asked one final question, her gaze unyielding. The prosecution did not test the evidence. Their only witness is uncertain. So how can you convict me beyond a reasonable doubt? This time. No one had an answer. Prosecutor Reed stood rigid. But he knew he was losing. He could push forward, but the jury was already doubting. And once doubt seeped in, the case was no longer solid. Judge Whitmore glanced at Naomi, then at the jury. Finally, he struck his gavel against the bench. I am ordering a recess for a re-evaluation of the evidence. Naomi didn't smile. She didn't celebrate. She simply knew. She had won a critical battle. The 14-year-old had not only defended herself. She had proven that even the most powerful systems could be challenged, if you knew the right questions to ask. The atmosphere in the courtroom had shifted entirely. Those who had once been certain of Naomi Carter's guilt were now wavering. Those who had silently judged her were now beginning to ask questions. And the jury, the very people who held Naomi's fate in their hands, were now sitting up straighter, listening to her every word with newfound attentiveness. But the battle wasn't over. Prosecutor Gregory Reed had not given up. Though his confidence had wavered, he still fought to maintain control. He took a deep breath, adjusted his tie, and turned back to the jury. Ladies and gentlemen, his voice remained steady, though it lacked the absolute certainty it once had. I ask you to remember this. Despite a few minor inconsistencies, the most important facts remain unchanged. The defendant was found near the crime scene, and the surveillance footage clearly shows someone matching her appearance. He paced slowly across the courtroom, his gaze sweeping over each juror. I understand, he continued, that Miss Carter has made you question certain details. But think carefully. How does an innocent person react? They panic. They beg for mercy. But her. He stopped, turning sharply to face Naomi. She isn't like that. From the very beginning, she has known exactly what to say, exactly what to do. She hasn't been afraid. She hasn't been confused. She has counted every piece of evidence. And tell me, does that sound like an innocent victim? Or does it sound like someone who is very, very familiar with the law? A few jurors furrowed their brows. An old tactic, planting doubt. Reed was trying to shift the narrative, making Naomi appear more calculated than wrongfully accused. Naomi took a deep breath. She could feel the weight of the stares pressing against her, waiting for her response, and she didn't make them wait long. She stood up slowly, her posture straight, her gaze locked onto the jury. Her voice was calm, but there was a power beneath it. I know what you're thinking. She let the words sink in. Why am I not panicked? Why do I know how to counter these arguments? She paused, scanning each juror's face. I'll tell you why. Because I know I'm innocent. And because I know that if I don't defend myself, no one else will. She walked slowly around the defense table, letting her words settle. I have sat here, listening to them talk about me as if I were a criminal. I have heard them call me, the defendant, as if that automatically means I am guilty. But what they have never done is prove my guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. She stopped, pointing to the screen where the surveillance footage remained frozen. This person in the video may look like me, but that is not me. And if they truly believed I was the person in this footage, why didn't they check the fingerprints on the ring? Why didn't they do anything to verify what they call clear evidence? A heavy silence filled the courtroom. Prosecutor Reed clenched his fist but said nothing. Naomi continued, her voice now softer but carrying even more weight. I want you to put yourself in my position. Imagine being accused of a crime you didn't commit. Imagine being looked at with suspicion, even when you know you've done nothing wrong. And imagine that no matter what you say, no matter what you do, people will still want to see you as guilty. She looked into the eyes of each juror. I don't have the luxury of panicking or begging for mercy. I can only stand up and fight for the truth. Not a single juror moved. They weren't listening to her as a defendant anymore. They were listening to her as a human being. Naomi took one last breath before delivering her final blow. If I were truly guilty, the prosecutor wouldn't need to make you doubt me. He would simply prove it. But look at him, right now. He isn't presenting evidence anymore. He's trying to make me look suspicious. She turned to Reed. Her gaze sharp. And that is not justice. That is manipulation. Reed gritted his teeth. He knew the case was slipping away. Judge Whitmore banged his gavel, signaling the courtroom back to order. He looked at the jury, then spoke. You have heard both sides. It is now time to reach a verdict. The jury left to deliberate. The entire courtroom held its breath, and then, after what felt like an eternity, they returned. The foreman stood, holding the verdict in his hands. The judge asked, "Has the jury reached a decision?" The man nodded. "Yes, Your Honor." He unfolded the paper and read aloud, "We, the jury, find the defendant, Naomi Carter, not guilty." A second of absolute silence. Then the room erupted in whispers, sighs of relief, hushed conversations. Elijah Carter, Naomi's grandfather, closed his eyes for a brief moment, as if finally able to breathe after endless days of tension. Naomi didn't cry. She didn't collapse from emotion. She simply stood there, taking a slow breath before looking at Prosecutor Reed, and for the first time, he was the one who had to look away. The gavel struck, echoing like a final bell marking the end of the trial. In that moment, every sound in the courtroom seemed to fade away, as if the entire world had paused to take a breath. Then, after a single beat of silence, murmurs spread through the room, relieved sighs breaking through the tension that had stretched for far too long. The defendant, Naomi Carter, not guilty. Those words repeated in Naomi's mind like a song she could hardly believe she was hearing. She had fought with everything she had, her intelligence, her reasoning, her unwavering resolve, and now, she had won. Prosecutor Gregory Reed remained frozen at his desk. His face no longer carried the composure he had maintained throughout the trial. His sharp eyes flickered toward the jury, as if struggling to comprehend how they could have reached this verdict. He was used to winning, used to steering the courtroom in his favor. But today, control had slipped through his fingers. Naomi didn't look at Reed. She didn't need to. She stood slowly, her hands still resting on the table, feeling the weight of her newfound freedom with each breath. The handcuffs had been removed. But truthfully, she had stopped feeling them long ago. The doors of the courtroom swung open, revealing the world outside, a world that, not long ago, had seemed ready to shut her out forever. Elijah Carter, Naomi's grandfather, stood quietly at the back of the room, watching everything unfold. He didn't speak, but his eyes carried something stronger than words, a quiet pride, a belief that had never wavered. Naomi stepped down the courthouse stairs, feeling the solid ground beneath her feet more real than ever before. She had not only saved herself, she had done something that so many people never got the chance to do. She had stood against the system and won. But as she walked through those doors, she realized something more important than the freedom she had just reclaimed. How many others had been in this same position without the chance to fight. How many teenagers had stepped into a courtroom in prison uniforms, with no one to stand up for them, no one to believe in them, no one to help them expose the truth. She had been lucky, not because the system had given her a chance, but because she had the knowledge, the ability to defend herself. But what about those who didn't? Naomi turned to look back at the courthouse. She had won her case, but her battle wasn't truly over. She knew that there were many others, people like her, who were being crushed by an unjust system. And they needed someone like her to stand up. Elijah Carter watched his granddaughter, his eyes thoughtful. Then, as if understanding exactly what was running through her mind, he gave a slow, knowing nod. "You have a gift, Naomi," he said, his voice steady with the weight of his years. Naomi looked at him, listening in silence. "You understand the law. You know how to fight. Not everyone has that, and if you do, don't let it be just for yourself." His words settled deep within her. He didn't need to explain further. She understood. She hadn't just reclaimed her freedom. She had found her purpose. She didn't know exactly what her path forward would look like, but she knew she couldn't ignore what she had learned, what she had just proven. She would use it. She would use it to help others. She would use it to ensure that no one else would have to sit where she had sat. feeling like they were being swallowed whole by a system that had already decided their fate. Naomi Carter, the 14-year-old girl once seen as a criminal, had now become a warrior for justice, and this was only the beginning. Epilogue and a message to you. Naomi Carter's story is not just about a 14-year-old who was wrongfully accused and fought to reclaim her freedom. It is a story about the power of knowledge, the courage to stand up, and the fight for justice. The legal system is not always perfect. At times, it can be manipulated, exploited, and shaped to fit what people want to believe rather than the truth, but the important thing is this: no matter how flawed the system is, there will always be those who challenge it, who refuse to accept injustice, who fight for what is right. Naomi Carter did just that. She didn't just win her freedom. She showed the world that even a 14-year-old could make the system question itself, and if she could do that, so can you. So, if you've ever felt wronged, if you've ever been treated unfairly, if you've ever thought that your voice doesn't matter, remember that justice is not something that is simply given. It is something that must be fought for. Naomi's story is a reminder that, with knowledge, determination, and belief in the truth, even the most unshakable systems can be challenged. Naomi Carter changed her story. Now, it's your turn. Will you stand up? Or will you let others write your story for you? Naomi Carter, the 14-year-old, and her fight for justice. The gavel struck firmly. The courtroom fell silent. Then, the jury's voice rang out, each word clear and deliberate. We, the jury, find the defendant, Naomi Carter, not guilty. For a few seconds, the air seemed frozen. No one moved, no one breathed too loudly. Then, like a wave crashing onto the shore, murmurs erupted across the room. Naomi sat still, her eyes wide. She had prepared herself to fight until the very end. But now that victory was here. She almost couldn't believe it. She had done it. She had won. Elijah Carter, her grandfather, sat behind her, his expression unchanged, but Naomi saw the way he exhaled, slowly, as if he had been holding his breath since the trial began. Prosecutor Gregory Reed remained motionless, his face unreadable. He had no words left. No further arguments. Judge Whitmore looked at Naomi, his gaze different from before. At first, he had seen her as just another juvenile defendant, just another simple case. But now, he saw her for what she truly was, a person who had taken control of her own fate and turned an entire trial around. The defendant is free to go, he declared. Naomi stood. The cold metal of the handcuffs was removed from her wrists. Though she had stopped feeling them long ago, she stepped out of the courtroom, her eyes no longer filled with fear or uncertainty as she passed through the courthouse doors. Sunlight streamed down on her, illuminating her like the first page of a new chapter. The journey is not over. Elijah Carter walked beside her, silent for a moment. Then, in his steady voice, he said, "You have a gift, Naomi." She turned to him, listening. "You don't just know the law, you know how to fight. And not everyone has that ability." Naomi said nothing. "You defended yourself. But out there, many people can't do the same." His words sank deep into her thoughts. She had spent every moment focused on winning back her own freedom. But now, she couldn't ignore the question forming in her mind: how many others have been in her position, but had no one to stand up for them? She couldn't change their past, but maybe she could change the future. Naomi turned back to glance at the courthouse. The place that had nearly turned her into just another statistic was now the place where she found a new purpose. She would use what she had learned. She would fight for others. She would make sure that no one else had to go through what she had endured. A new path. Naomi Carter, once a 14-year-old wrongly accused, had now become a fighter for justice, and this was only the beginning. We, the jury, find the defendant, Naomi Carter, not guilty. The words thundered through the tense atmosphere of the courtroom, shattering the silence like a lightning bolt. For a brief moment, everything was still, then whispers erupted across the room. Some sighed in relief. Others exchanged astonished glances. Naomi Carter remained motionless. She had prepared for every possibility, for injustice, for the need to keep fighting. But she had won. Prosecutor Gregory Reed stood frozen, his face unreadable, though the defeat in his eyes was undeniable. He hadn't expected this. He had assumed this would be just another straightforward case. A quick conviction. But Naomi had changed everything. Judge Whitmore gave a slight nod. His gaze toward Naomi no longer indifferent. The defendant is free to go. Naomi rose. The cold metal of the cuffs was removed from her wrists. Though she had long stopped feeling their weight, she walked slowly across the courtroom. Her fear replaced with unwavering certainty. As the doors swung open, sunlight poured in, bathing her in its warmth, a reminder that freedom had truly returned. A crucial realization outside the courthouse. Elijah Carter, her grandfather, stood waiting. He didn't speak at first, simply watching her with an expression full of meaning. Then, in his steady, measured voice, he said, "You have a gift, Naomi." Naomi furrowed her brows slightly. "Listening? You understand the law. You know how to fight. But not everyone does." She remained silent. "You defended yourself. But how many others out there never even get the chance?" His words made her pause. Until now, she had focused solely on proving her own innocence, on escaping the trap the justice system had set for her. But now, she couldn't help but ask herself, how many others had been in her position, without knowledge, without a voice, without a chance to fight back? She had been lucky, not because the system had protected her, but because she had known how to fight it. But what about those who didn't? Naomi turned back to look at the courthouse. She had won today, but this wasn't the end. She had found her purpose, a new beginning. Naomi Carter, once a 14-year-old wrongly accused, had now become a fighter for justice, and this was only the beginning. "We, the jury, find the defendant, Naomi Carter, not guilty." Those words echoed through the courtroom, marking the conclusion of a trial that had seemed predetermined from the start. But Naomi Carter had changed everything in that moment. She did not sigh in relief, nor did she break into tears of joy. She simply sat still, letting the weight of those words sink in. She had fought, not with pleas or desperation, but with intellect, reasoning, and unwavering determination. As the handcuffs were removed from her wrists, Naomi stood up, stepping forward with slow but steady strides. She was no longer a defendant awaiting judgment, no longer a child forced into a powerless position. She had proven that even a 14-year-old could make the justice system question itself. She walked out of the courthouse, the sunlight pouring over her face. But she wasn't just stepping into freedom, she was stepping into an entirely new understanding, an awakening. Elijah Carter stood waiting outside. His face remained calm, but his eyes carried something Naomi understood well, a quiet, profound pride. As she approached, he spoke just one simple question. "Do you understand what this truly means?" Naomi remained silent. "You defended yourself. But how many others out there never get that chance?" His words made her pause. Throughout the trial, she had fought for herself. But now, she realized that countless others had been swallowed by the system without ever having a voice. They had been judged before they even had the chance to prove the truth. They didn't have the knowledge to defend themselves. They had no one to stand up for them. Naomi had once been one of them. But she had won, and now, she had a choice. She could walk away, put everything behind her, and continue her life as if none of this had ever happened, or she could stand up, use what she had learned, and make sure others didn't have to endure the same injustice. She turned to look back at the courthouse, the place that had almost buried her future, then took a deep breath. She knew what she had to do. A new beginning. Naomi Carter had not only reclaimed her freedom, she had found her purpose. She would fight not just for herself, but for those who couldn't fight for themselves, and this was only the beginning. "We, the jury, find the defendant, Naomi Carter, not guilty." Those words echoed through the courtroom, shattering the tension that had hung in the air throughout the trial. For a brief moment, silence filled the room, as if everyone was trying to process what had just been declared. Then, slowly, relieved sighs broke the stillness, followed by murmurs spreading across the courtroom. Naomi Carter stood motionless. She didn't tremble, didn't break down in tears of relief. She simply closed her eyes for a second, took a deep breath, and then opened them again, filled with a new sense of determination. She had done it. She had fought, not with emotions, but with intellect, with sharp reasoning, with an understanding of the law that even the seasoned professionals in the room had not expected. And now, she had won. The cuffs around her wrists were removed. She rubbed her wrists lightly, feeling the indentations left by days of unjust captivity. But now, nothing could bind her anymore. She turned her gaze toward Prosecutor Gregory Reed. He remained standing, his face unreadable, but his eyes spoke volumes. Defeat. He was used to winning, to controlling the narrative of every trial. But today, everything had changed. Naomi didn't say anything to him. She didn't need to. She walked out of the courthouse, the place that had threatened to steal her future. But as she stepped forward, she wasn't just leaving a building. She was stepping onto an entirely new path, a new awakening. Elijah Carter stood waiting at the courthouse steps. His gaze steady yet filled with pride as Naomi approached. He spoke slowly, each word carrying weight. "You know, you didn't just win a trial today." Naomi looked at him, waiting for more. "You proved that even the strongest system can make mistakes. And if it could be wrong about you, it could be wrong about many others." Those words echoed in Naomi's mind. She had fought to reclaim her freedom. But how many others out there never got that chance? How many had been wrongfully convicted simply because they didn't know how to defend themselves? Naomi had once thought her battle would end the moment she walked out of this courthouse. But now, she realized it was only just beginning. She couldn't turn her back on those still trapped in the system. Those who also deserved justice. She wouldn't let anyone else suffer what she had endured. She would stand up not just for herself, but for those without a voice. A new journey begins. Naomi Carter walked out of that courtroom as a free person, but more importantly, she walked out with a purpose. She was no longer just a girl wrongfully accused. She was a warrior for justice, and this was only the beginning.